The rain fell in silver sheets that November morning, drumming against the small cluster of black umbrellas gathered around the polished oak casket. Elizabeth Warner, Libby to everyone who knew her, stood motionless as raindrops mingled with the tears on her face. Beside her, Samantha, Sam, her identical twin in appearance only, shifted her weight from one foot to another, her practical nature already calculating what came next. The sisters watched as their mother's casket was lowered into the sodden earth of the Cape Cod cemetery, taking with it the last anchor they had to what most people would call normal life. Rose Warner had been a woman who lived in the spaces between other people's lives, cleaning their homes, polishing their silver, and dusting their untouched guest rooms. Rich people, she would tell her daughters after a long day, her hands red from bleach and hard work. They build their lives out of things they never touch, houses too big to live in, rooms they never walk into. You can smell the dust of their comfort. The sisters stood alone long after the others had departed, the identical planes of their faces, one softened by idealism, one sharpened by pragmatism, reflected in the puddles forming at their feet. "We should go," Sam finally said, practical even in grief. "There's nothing more we can do here." But Libby lingered, fingers tracing the simple granite marker. Her mother's name seemed strange carved in stone, too permanent for a woman who had moved through the world so lightly, leaving barely a trace. "I keep thinking there should be more," she whispered. "More people, more words, more something." Sam squeezed her sister's shoulder. "Mom didn't need more, Lib. She just needed us." The weeks that followed passed in a blur of paperwork and quiet desperation. Their small Boston apartment, always modest but dignified under Rose's care, now felt like a countdown clock ticking toward eviction. Bills arrived with alarming regularity, each one stamped in increasingly urgent red lettering. Libby sat at the kitchen table one evening, surrounded by freelance writing assignments that paid too little too late, while Sam counted out tips from her double shifts at the moving company. "We're short," Sam announced, pushing away the neat stacks of bills. "Again! The Atlantic might pick up my piece on forgotten women in photojournalism," Libby offered, though they both knew the payment, if it came, would be weeks away. "Might," Sam echoed. "We can't pay rent with might, Lib. We can't eat might." She ran her fingers through her short, practical haircut, so different from Libby's longer waves. "I'm thinking of taking on weekend moving jobs. The pay's better." "You already work 60 hours a week," Libby protested, "and you're chasing bylines that barely cover groceries." Sam's words weren't cruel, just factual, the way she saw the world. "Mom spent her whole life cleaning other people's houses so we could have choices. But at some point, we have to choose to survive." The argument was familiar territory, well-trodden ground between idealism and pragmatism. But that night, exhaustion gave Sam's words a sharper edge. "Not everyone gets to follow dreams, Libby. Some of us just have to keep the lights on." Later that night, as Libby tried to sleep on their worn couch, she heard Sam's laptop keys clicking steadily from the kitchen. Her sister had always been a night owl, but lately sleep seemed a luxury Sam couldn't afford. The next morning, Libby awoke to find Sam standing over her, laptop open, an unusual light in her eyes. "I found something," Sam said, turning the screen toward Libby. "Look at this." The screen showed a property listing, a large colonial house photographed at an unflattering angle, its white paint faded to bone, shutters hanging at tired angles. But it was the price that made Libby sit up straighter. Impossibly low for a property of that size. "It's in Hyannis Point," Sam continued, scrolling to show more photos, "an estate sale. The listing says, historic property requires restoration, but the price is ridiculous. Less than what we'd pay for a used car." Libby peered at the screen, noting the weathered flagpole leaning toward the sea, the overgrown hedges shrouding what must once have been a sweeping view. There has to be a catch. Sam scrolled to the bottom of the listing. Previously utilized by members of the Kennedy family during the early 1960s, she read aloud, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper on the name Kennedy. Libby felt a jolt of recognition. As a journalist focused on forgotten histories, the Kennedy era represented the intersection of power, mythology, and the stories that fell between the cracks of official narratives. It's probably falling apart, Sam continued, but her eyes held a calculating gleam. But with that history restored properly, we could run tours, hold events, market it as a piece of Camelot. There are people who'd pay just to stand where JFK once stood. It feels wrong somehow, Libby said slowly, commercializing history. Is it better to let it rot? Sam countered. Besides, we'd be preserving something that might otherwise be lost. A week later, they drove south from Boston in Sam's company van, the rattling engine struggling against the coastal wind. As the urban landscape gave way to the manicured wealth of Cape Cod, both sisters fell silent, taking in the white fences and emerald lawns that seemed more like statements than boundaries. The deeper they drove into Hyannis Point, the more Libby felt the difference. Here, people didn't live to survive. They lived to continue a legacy. The house stood at the end of a narrow, unmarked road, half hidden behind tall hedges that had long ago abandoned any pretense of decoration. Up close, it was larger than either had expected, colonial in style, with a certain dignity that persisted despite the decay. The shutters hung crooked like tired eyelids, and grass reached up to the porch steps. The air carried the mingled scents of mildew, pine, and salt from the nearby sea. Jeffrey Palmer, the real estate agent, awaited them on the porch, a thin man with a crisp smile that didn't reach his anxious eyes. He spoke quickly, words tumbling out as though rehearsed. Ladies, you'll find it's got great bones, solid construction, original features, coastal history. Some people say President Kennedy himself visited more than once. His voice dipped slightly at the end, a hesitation that Libby immediately noted. Some people? She asked. Palmer's smile tightened. Well, local legends. You know how small towns are. But yes, it's documented that members of the family spent time here. Hasn't been occupied since the late 60s. Inside, the air hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of dust. The staircase curved upward into darkness, its wooden banister worn smooth by hands long gone. Faded wallpaper peeled in the strips, revealing layers of older designs beneath. Flowers giving way to stripes, giving way to geometric patterns, each a ghost of a different era. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, its mantel carved with initials too worn to read. Libby wandered slowly, trailing her fingers along the dusty surfaces. Light fell through salt-streaked windows in narrow bands, cutting through the gloom like spotlights on an abandoned stage. It feels like time stopped here, she said softly, an odd reverence in her voice. The house seemed to be holding its breath, not abandoned, but waiting. Sam, standing by a window, was already calculating repairs in her mind. Time stopped because nobody could afford to start it again, she said practically. Roof, plumbing, foundation, none of it's going to be cheap. Palmer led them through the rooms quickly, as though afraid of lingering too long in anyone's space. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked underfoot. A hallway stretched into shadow, lined with closed doors like secrets waiting to be revealed. You'll find all utilities are disconnected, Palmer said, opening doors to reveal empty rooms with peeling paint. But the structure's sound, just needs a little love. In one of the bedrooms, Libby stopped, arrested by a single black and white photograph still hanging crookedly on the wall. It showed a group of people in summer clothes, laughing on the lawn that must have once been immaculately kept. A tall man in sunglasses stood slightly apart, his face half turned toward the camera. The resemblance was unmistakable. John F. Kennedy. The photograph had yellowed at the edges, the image slightly blurred, but the energy captured in it remained vivid and alive. Libby stared at it for a long time, feeling as though she had stumbled onto something intimate and unguarded. A moment of history not posed for posterity, but simply lived. Downstairs, Sam was talking terms with Palmer. "So," she said when Libby reappeared, "what do you think?" "It's a lot of work," Libby answered honestly. "It's a lot of history," Sam countered, a familiar gleam in her eye. Palmer, sensing hesitation, jumped in. "Ladies, I should mention the property has been on the market for years. The town would like to see it occupied again. Frankly, it makes the neighbors nervous, sitting empty like this. You could probably have it for even less than the asking price if you move quickly." "Why nervous?" Libby asked, journalist instincts prickling. Palmer paused, his smile faltering. "Old rumors," he said finally. "Strange things after the 60s. The last caretaker swore he heard voices, but it's just an old house settling. Nothing unusual." He said it too casually, as though he had practiced sounding unconcerned. When they stepped back outside, the wind from the ocean carried the faint cry of gulls. The house loomed behind them, its windows like tired eyes watching their deliberation. Sam lit a cigarette, squinting at the roofline. "We could turn this into something," she said, exhaling. "Tours, private events, a piece of history with our name on it." "It should be preserved, not marketed," Libby argued. Sam laughed softly. "Preserved doesn't pay the bills, Lib." Palmer handed them the papers, pen extended. "If you're serious, I can process this today. I'll even throw in a contact for local contractors who've worked on heritage properties." Sam didn't hesitate. "Let's do it," she said, signing her name with a flourish before handing the pen to Libby. Libby looked at the line beneath her sister's bold handwriting, her own name waiting to join it. She thought of their mother, of her hands red from bleach, of her saying that houses held more than furniture. They held secrets. She signed. That night, they stayed in the house for the first time, setting up sleeping bags in the living room, lighting candles when their flashlight batteries dimmed. The house creaked and sighed around them with every gust of wind, its timbers adjusting to new inhabitants after decades of solitude. Libby couldn't sleep. She listened to the distant crash of waves and the occasional drip from a leaking pipe somewhere overhead. At one point, she thought she heard something shift upstairs, not loudly, just enough to make her heart quicken. "Probably raccoons," Sam muttered, half asleep beside her. But when the sound came again, softer, like the slow closing of a door, neither spoke. Sometime after midnight, Libby rose and walked into the hallway. The moonlight through the window outlined her reflection faintly in an old mirror near the staircase. For a second, she could almost swear another figure stood behind her, a trick of light and exhaustion. She turned, but the hallway was empty. She returned to her sleeping bag, shivering despite the summer warmth. "You awake?" Sam whispered. "Yeah," Libby answered. "Do you still think we did the right thing?" Sam chuckled softly, already drifting back to sleep. "Houses don't remember, Lib. People do." But as the night stretched on, the wind rose again, sweeping through the empty rooms. Somewhere in the house, a shutter banged once, twice, then stilled, as if marking time for someone no longer there to hear it. Morning arrived pale and thin, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. The air inside was cold enough that Libby could see her breath when she exhaled. The first light revealed what the candlelight had hidden: dust thick enough to coat everything, cobwebs looping from corners to light fixtures, water stains creeping down the walls like faded veins. Yet for all its decay, the place was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not abandoned, but waiting. Libby explored while Sam slept on, drawn to the upstairs bedroom where the photograph still hung. In daylight, She noticed details invisible the night before. The exact date printed on a newspaper visible in one corner of the image. August 1963, just months before Dallas. She studied the faces around Kennedy, particularly a tall black man standing slightly apart from the group, a camera hanging from his neck. There was something in his posture, pride but also a quiet distance, that felt familiar. Near the bed, she discovered a wooden trunk with a brass latch tarnished green with age. It opened with a sigh, revealing linens folded so neatly they might have been arranged yesterday. Beneath them lay a stack of old magazines, Lifetime Look, their covers displaying the early 60s frozen in glossy perfection. But it was what lay beneath the magazines that made her breath catch. A sealed envelope marked in elegant handwriting. Property of H.L. Jackson, Nova 63. The ink had faded to a reddish brown, but the letters remained clear, deliberate. The envelope was heavier than it should be, thick and stiff. Inside, when she finally dared to open it, were several strips of photographic negative curled with age. Light through the window caught the faint outlines of figures. A man standing with his back to the camera, a convertible parked on gravel, and in one frame, a face so clear it sent a jolt through her. Kennedy, younger looking than in most official portraits, his smile open and unguarded. "What did you find?" Sam's voice from the doorway made Libby start. "I'm not sure," Libby said, holding up the negatives. "They're marked with a name, H.L. Jackson, November 1963. That's the month." "The assassination," Sam finished, stepping closer. "Let me see." Together they examined the negatives against the window light. Even reversed in darkened light, they could make out the unmistakable setting of the house and grounds around them. The same white fence visible through the window. The same lawn where the photograph on the wall had been taken. "You realize what this means?" Sam whispered, excitement building in her voice. "We've got original shots of JFK, maybe from his last week alive, taken by a photographer who vanished. Do you know what collectors would pay for these?" But Libby wasn't thinking about money. Her mind was racing with questions. Who was H.L. Jackson? Why had he hidden these images? And what had happened to him after November 1963? History had just become tangible, and it was lying in their hands like an exposed nerve. Have you ever felt that certain places hold on to memories, refusing to let them fade? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By late afternoon, the sisters had driven into town with the envelope sealed carefully inside a cardboard tube. Hyannis Point in daylight was postcard perfect. Clapboard houses, neat sidewalks, flags fluttering in the sea breeze. People glanced at their battered van, two strangers in a place that rarely saw outsiders. They found a small photo shop that looked as if it hadn't changed since the 70s, the air inside heavy with the scent of chemicals and paper. An elderly man behind the counter looked up from a tray of prints, eyebrows rising at their request. "You're saying these were shot in '63? You found them where?" His skepticism was palpable. "In an old house," Libby said carefully, unwilling to reveal too much. The man studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Well, if they're real, you've got something special. But film that old, you have to handle it right. I can try to make contact sheets. No promises." They left the negatives with him and went for coffee while they waited, Sam drumming her fingers restlessly on the table, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. "Listen, if these come out even half decent, we've got options," she said, leaning forward. "Private collectors, museums, maybe a magazine would pay for exclusive rights. This could solve everything, Lib." "Or we could give them to the Kennedy Library," Libby countered. "They'd preserve them properly." Sam looked at her incredulously. "And they'd give us what? A thank you letter? A mention in the footnotes? This is our shot." When they returned to the shop, the man handed them a single envelope. "They're delicate," he said. "Some frames are gone, But these are clear enough. Libby opened the envelope and drew out the contact sheet. Her breath caught. There was Kennedy again, smiling on the lawn, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. There was the tall photographer, now visible in a reflection from a window, caught in the act of capturing the scene. And in one frame, blurred but legible, the corner of a newspaper dated November 17th, 1963, 5 days before Dallas. "That's it," Sam whispered, a grin spreading across her face. "That's history. We hit gold." On the drive back, she kept talking about numbers, auctions, valuations, potential buyers. Libby barely listened, her gaze drawn repeatedly to the contact sheet on her lap, to the unguarded moments of a man who had no idea his days were numbered, captured by a photographer whose own fate remained a mystery. Somewhere between the shop and this moment, 60 years had collapsed into a single heartbeat. That night they ate takeout in the kitchen, sitting on crates, using paper weights to hold down the corners of the photos as they studied every detail. "You realize," Libby said quietly, "that whoever took these was with Kennedy just days before Dallas? If Jackson was close enough to take these informal shots, so what if he saw something?" Sam asked, following her sister's train of thought. "What if that's why he disappeared?" Sam gave a short laugh. "Don't start with conspiracy talk. The guy probably just moved on, maybe even drowned. We're on the coast, remember?" "Maybe," Libby conceded, leaning back. "But these were hidden. Someone wanted them kept out of sight. Or someone just forgot about them," Sam countered. "People move. Things get packed away. Don't make this bigger than it is." Libby smiled faintly. "You really think this house has forgotten anything?" Later, after Sam had gone to bed, Libby stayed up with a flashlight, wandering through the silent halls. She found herself drawn again to the photograph in the upstairs room, comparing it to the contact sheet in her hand. Same lawn, same fence, same light falling across the wooden porch railing. In the quiet darkness, she imagined the laughter from that day, the click of the camera shutter, the low murmur of conversation. The man behind the lens, H.L. Jackson, had stood right here, framing the world through glass, not knowing that in a few days the world would change forever. The next morning, Libby began her research. Online archives revealed little about H.L. Jackson, just a few mentions in photographic credits from 1962, then nothing after November 1963. She expanded her search, digging deeper into Kennedy's unofficial entourage. One interview from 1970 caught her attention. A former Kennedy aide mentioning an African-American photographer who sometimes traveled with the president unofficially. Not on the White House payroll, but someone who had access most didn't. He had a way of asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Sam, meanwhile, focused on practical matters. She hired 2 local contractors, older men with weathered hands and skeptical eyes, to assess the foundation and electrical systems. They moved through the house with careful efficiency, speaking to each other in low Portuguese when they thought no one was listening. One evening, a week after moving in, Libby found Sam on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in a hushed tone. "Yes, the images appear authentic. No, I understand the sensitivity. A private viewing could be arranged." When she hung up, Libby was watching from the doorway. "Who was that?" "A collector I know in Boston," Sam answered too casually. "Just exploring options." "Without discussing it first?" Sam sighed. "We need money, Lib. The foundation repairs alone will cost more than we have." "So you're ready to sell history to the highest bidder?" The words came out sharper than Libby intended. "I'm trying to be practical," Sam snapped back. "One of us has to be." The argument might have escalated further, but a noise from the basement interrupted them. A sharp call from one of the workers. "Senora Sam, venga ver, come see." They found the older worker, Manuel, standing at the bottom of the basement stairs, pointing at a section of the far wall. The workers had stripped away rotting paneling and plaster, revealing a patch of smooth, pale wood that didn't match the rest of the foundation. It was newer, cleaner, and when Manuel tapped it, the sound was hollow, suggesting space behind. "What is it?" Libby asked, descending the steps. "There's something behind it," Sam said, pressing her ear against the wall. "Like a room." Manuel crossed himself, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. His younger partner backed away slightly. "Can you open it?" Sam asked. Manuel hesitated. "Maybe not good idea, Senora. Some things better left alone." Sam laughed nervously. "You're getting superstitious now." She grabbed a crowbar and wedged it between the boards. They came loose with surprising ease, dust pouring out like smoke, carrying the smell of old paper and something else. Something faintly sour, like mildew mixed with chemical preservatives. The opening revealed a small space barely larger than a closet. Libby lifted her flashlight, sweeping it across the interior. The beam caught on an object in the corner, a metal chair, rusted through at the legs. Beside it, on a small wooden shelf, sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder coated in grime, its reels still threaded with tape. Next to it were several small boxes, each labeled in neat handwriting, dates ranging from October to November 1963. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against their throats. "Holy," Sam whispered. Libby stepped forward, her heart hammering. The boxes were perfectly aligned, untouched by rodents or decay. She reached out carefully, brushing away a layer of dust to read the labels more clearly. Nov 10, private. Nov 17, Dallas trip discussion. Nov 19, final prep. She felt her mouth go dry. These could be his, Jackson's. Sam crouched beside her, excitement flickering in her eyes. "Tapes? You think there's something on them?" "There's only one way to find out. Have you ever discovered something that made you feel like you were touching history itself?" Share your experience in the comments below. They carried the recorder and tapes upstairs to the dining room table. The machine was heavier than it looked, but miraculously intact. The plug was brittle, the cord frayed, but with an adapter they managed to connect it. The first tape refused to play, the reel frozen from age. The second moved reluctantly, emitting a low hum before sputtering to life. Static filled the room. Then faintly a voice emerged. A man's voice, low and deliberate. "Understand this. Can't leave here. Too many eyes already." Another voice interrupted, sharper, authoritative. "He'll do as he's told. The photographs are locked up. The boy knows his place." Sam froze. Libby turned up the volume, her pulse racing. "We can't risk exposure before Dallas. If he talks, it's not just him. Johnson would have my head if this leaks to the press." A third voice, quieter but commanding. "Make sure he understands what's at stake here. We're not talking about some society party photos. This is national security." "What about the photographer? Jackson's been asking questions." "He knows better. He wouldn't be the first colored boy to disappear." The tape stuttered, crackled, then fell silent. Neither spoke for a long time. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the walls closer. "Jesus Christ," Sam muttered finally. "Is that what I think it is?" Libby rewound slightly, played the same section again. The words were unmistakable. Powerful men planning something that history would later reduce to speculation. "These tapes," Libby whispered, "they could rewrite everything we know about what happened." Sam's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "They could make us, you mean? Do you have any idea what people would pay for this kind of evidence?" Libby stared at her in disbelief. "You can't be serious. This isn't memorabilia, Sam. This is evidence. Real history. People died because of whatever's on these tapes." "History doesn't pay our mortgage," Sam shot back. "We could sell copies, release just enough to—" "Do you hear yourself?" Libby slammed her palm against the table. "This isn't about profit. This is about truth. Someone died. Jackson died because of what's on these tapes. The sound of her voice echoed through the house. For a long time, neither spoke again. The only noise was the soft whir of the tape reel slowing to a stop, the thin hiss of silence resuming its dominion. That night, Libby couldn't sleep. She sat alone in the living room, listening to the waves crash against the shore. She thought about Jackson, this man who had stood so close to power, who had seen something that frightened the wrong people, who had hidden his evidence here and vanished. Around midnight, she heard Sam on the phone again. Her sister's voice was low, urgent, but the words carried through the thin walls. Yes, recording's authentic. No, I'm not saying we sell all of them, just one. Enough to prove it's real. Yes, we can arrange delivery. Libby's stomach turned. She stepped into the hallway, waiting for Sam to hang up. Who are you talking to? She demanded when Sam emerged from the kitchen. A contact. Someone who knows collectors. You're out of your mind. I'm trying to survive, Sam snapped. All your talk about truth and justice doesn't put food on the table. We have nothing, Lib. Nothing but this. We deserve something back. We deserve peace, Libby said, her voice softening. Not blood money. For a moment, something flickered in Sam's eyes. Doubt, maybe guilt, but it passed quickly. Peace doesn't exist for people like us, she said. Not unless we buy it. The next morning, Libby contacted Dr. Eleanor Franklin, a historian at Harvard specializing in 20th century political media. She described her discovery in careful terms, not mentioning the house's location or the tape's full contents. Dr. Franklin replied within hours. If you truly have information on H.L. Jackson, I'd like to meet. There are things about his disappearance that were never explained. Please use caution. Historical discoveries of this nature often attract unwanted attention. Libby didn't mention the meeting to Sam. By afternoon, strange occurrences began. A package arrived on the porch with no return address. Inside was a printout of the article Libby had published online about her initial research into Jackson, with a single line typed beneath it. Be careful what you dig up. Some ghosts still have friends. Sam swore when she saw it, tossing it onto the table. That's it. I told you this was a bad idea. It's probably just a prank, Libby said, though her voice was unsteady. Or someone doesn't want this story told. 2 days later, 2 men in dark suits arrived unannounced. They introduced themselves as representatives from the Kennedy Foundation, their voices calm, their smiles professional, but there was something too careful in the way they looked around the room. We understand you've come across some historical materials belonging to the former president, one said smoothly. We'd like to assist with their preservation and ensure they're handled appropriately. How did you hear about them? Libby asked, deliberately standing between them and the dining room where the tapes were stored. We follow these things, the man replied. Artifacts have a way of resurfacing. It's best when they're managed quietly. Libby felt a chill run through her. You've already spoken to my sister, haven't you? The man hesitated. We're aware of Miss Warner's inquiries. Then you know I won't be selling anything, Libby stated firmly. These tapes aren't property. They're history, and they belong in an archive where the public can hear them. The man's smile didn't falter, but it cooled. I understand your position, but I must advise you to be cautious. Sometimes when sensitive materials come to light, misunderstandings occur. Documents disappear. People's reputations get tangled in things they don't fully grasp. Is that a threat? Of course not, the man replied, looking mildly surprised. Just advice. He handed Libby a card. If you change your mind, call us. We can make this very easy for everyone. After they left, Libby locked the doors and hid the tapes behind the loose bricks in the fireplace, a trick her mother had once used to hide rent money from unscrupulous landlords. That evening, Sam didn't return until after dark. When she finally appeared, her shoulders were slumped, her expression troubled. They knew, she said hoarsely. Before I even said a word, They knew about the tapes. They said they were part of an ongoing federal review, that if I didn't cooperate, I could be charged with possession of classified materials. What did you tell them? Libby asked, heart sinking. Nothing. I walked out, but they followed me halfway home. She looked at Libby, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anger. You brought them here, didn't you? That article of yours. Now everyone knows. I didn't name the location, Libby defended. Someone else must have leaked it. Sam ran a hand through her hair. They're going to come for them, you know that. Those tapes, they'll take them, erase them, make sure nobody ever hears what's on them. Then we need to get them somewhere safe, Libby insisted. Sam gave a hollow laugh. Safe? There's no such thing. Not with people like that. That night, after hours of tense discussion, they seemed to reach a fragile truce. Sam suggested that Libby meet with Dr. Franklin, share what they had discovered, but without revealing the tape's location until the historian could verify their authenticity. That way, nobody can bury them again, Sam reasoned, her expression unreadable in the dim light. The next morning, Libby prepared to drive to Cambridge for her meeting, carefully packing her notes but leaving the original tapes hidden in the fireplace. Sam helped carry her research materials to the car, unusually silent except for a murmured, "Be careful." As Libby started the engine, she noticed her sister standing back on the porch, hands shoved deep into her pockets. For the first time, Sam looked old, worn down by choices that had eaten away at her certainty. The meeting with Dr. Franklin began well. The historian, a dignified woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a deliberate manner, examined Libby's transcriptions with growing interest. If these words are authentic, they're extraordinary, she said finally. But without the original recordings, her assistant entered the room with a note. Dr. Franklin read it, frowned, and looked back at Libby. Ms. Warner, there are men outside asking to speak with you. They say they're with the Federal Archive Division. Libby's heart sank. She didn't wait to see who they were, hastily gathered her papers, and slipped out through the back exit. She drove aimlessly for hours, afraid to return home, afraid of what she might find. When her phone buzzed repeatedly, Sam calling, she ignored it, suspicion overriding sisterly instinct. By the time she finally reached the house again, dusk had fallen. The wind off the ocean was cold and sharp. She parked, killed the lights, and sat for a moment, staring at the front door. Something felt wrong. The porch light, which Sam always left on, was dark. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fire. Inside, the house was silent. She called out her sister's name once, then again. No answer. In the living room, she found the table cleared, the tape recorder gone. When she rushed to the fireplace and shifted the loose bricks, her fears were confirmed. The hidden tapes were missing. On the wall above the mantel, where the Kennedy photograph had hung, there was now only a single note pinned to the frame. I did what I had to do. Don't follow me. The handwriting was Sam's. Libby stood motionless, the note trembling in her hand. She didn't know whether to feel relief or grief. She looked around at the hollow rooms, shadows stretching across the floor like accusing fingers, and realized that the house had fallen silent in a different way. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of something finished. Do you believe that spaces can hold memories of the past? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The morning after Sam's disappearance broke gray and unsteady, the air heavy with the kind of silence that follows a storm. The house felt emptier than before, its walls absorbing Libby's solitary footsteps without echo. She had read Sam's notes so many times that the words had begun to lose meaning, dissolving into mere shapes of ink. I did what I had to do. Don't follow me. For weeks, the house had pulsed with discovery and tension. Now it was only quiet, hollowed out by Sam's absence and the missing tapes. Libby made coffee and walked out onto the porch. The sea stretched pale and still, a sheet of pewter light to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Sam was driving, perhaps carrying the only remaining evidence of the truth they had unearthed. Strangely, Libby felt no anger toward her sister anymore, only a weary sadness. Sam had always wanted to win at life, to stop being at its mercy. The tapes had been her chance. Maybe in her own way, she thought she was protecting them both. The following days passed in a blur of unwanted attention. Journalists began to appear, drawn by whispers that the Kennedy Foundation's quiet inquiries had stirred. Some claimed to know about the tapes. Others were chasing rumors of new revelations about Dallas. Libby said nothing. She refused interviews, kept the doors locked, ignored the knocking that came like clockwork each afternoon. Dr. Franklin left 2 messages on her phone, her tone calm but urgent. Libby, whatever you have, it's not safe to keep there. Let us archive it properly. Don't let it disappear again. Disappear again. That phrase haunted her. By the end of the week, she decided to return to Cambridge to meet Dr. Franklin, not with the originals, which were gone with Sam, but with her notes, her memories, everything she could salvage of the truth. The historian greeted her in her office with the tired patience of someone who had been waiting too long for a fragile truth. If these transcriptions are accurate, she said after reading through Libby's notes, they're extraordinary, but without the tapes themselves, they'll never see daylight, Libby finished for her. Dr. Franklin nodded soberly. The government has an iron grip on this period. If they decide this material threatens national security, they'll bury it forever. Then what can I do? Libby asked, desperation edging her voice. Tell the story anyway, the older woman said simply. Without the tapes, without names. Write what you know, what you lived. People believe people, not recordings. The advice seemed too simple to carry any weight, but as Libby drove back home through the darkening afternoon, it began to settle in her like a slow realization. Perhaps truth didn't always need to survive as evidence. Maybe its power was in being spoken, remembered, retold. When she reached the house again, the porch light was on. She hadn't left it that way. For a moment she froze, every sense sharpening. The wind had picked up, moaning softly through the reeds near the shore. She stepped inside carefully, calling out, though she didn't expect an answer. The living room was empty, but on the table lay a small envelope that hadn't been there before. Her name was written on it in Sam's distinctive handwriting. The letters slanted and hurried. Inside was a single photograph. Sam standing on a pier, smiling faintly, the ocean behind her blinding with sunlight. Written on the back in her cramped handwriting were 4 words. Heard, safe, tell it right. For a long moment, Libby couldn't breathe. The photograph felt impossibly alive between her fingers, a pulse of connection across distance. It wasn't just proof that Sam was alive. It was an instruction, a charge. Her sister had taken the truth out of reach of those who wanted to erase it, but the burden of telling it had fallen to her. In the weeks that followed, Libby began to write. She used the dining room table as her desk, the sea as her metronome. The first draft was clumsy, too emotional, too full of anger. She rewrote it again and again, stripping away accusation and fear until only the bones of the story remained. A photographer who disappeared for knowing too much. 2 sisters who found what he left behind. The choice that divided them. One choosing silence, one choosing voice. Her article grew into a book, and her book grew into a movement. Small at first, letters from academics, students, old journalists who remembered the 1960s, then larger, reaching readers across the country who had always sensed there was more to the official narrative than they'd been told. Some called it fiction, others called it testimony. Without the tapes as evidence, no one could verify her claims. They were never seen again, but the story took on its own life, its own rhythm. People began to ask questions history had long ago learned not to answer. For all the public interest her work generated, Libby's nights remained quiet. She rarely turned on more than one light at a time, preserving the shadows that reminded her of the night they had opened the hidden room, the faint metallic whisper of a reel spinning somewhere deep in memory. She never went back into the basement. Some doors once opened no longer needed revisiting. As her book gained attention, the men from the Kennedy Foundation returned. This time their smiles were gone, replaced by thinly veiled threats. "You understand that these fabrications could be considered defamatory," the older one said, standing in her living room uninvited. "The Kennedy family still wields considerable influence." "I haven't named names," Libby replied evenly, "and I've been clear that I don't have the tapes anymore. But you've created a narrative, a dangerous one. I've told a story about history being erased, about powerful men making decisions that cost lives." The man stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Stories have consequences, Ms. Warner." 2 nights later, Libby woke to the sound of glass breaking downstairs. She called the police from her bedroom, listening to footsteps moving through her house, drawers being opened, furniture shifted. By the time the officers arrived, the intruders were gone. Nothing of value had been taken, but her research files had been ransacked, her computer missing. The message was clear. Someone still didn't want this story told. The break-in made the local papers. That publicity, ironically, sent her book sales soaring. What had been a small publishing phenomenon became a national conversation. Television producers called. Documentary filmmakers appeared on her doorstep. Through it all, Libby kept looking for some word from Sam. Months passed with no contact, until one cold December morning, a postcard arrived from San Francisco. No message, just a photo of the Golden Gate Bridge and Sam's initial S scrawled in the corner. She was alive and she was watching. Spring turned to summer and summer to fall. The house, once a place of secrecy, now stood as a kind of lighthouse for those seeking truth. Visitors arrived sometimes. Journalists, historians, students. They'd ask about the tapes, about Sam, about what was real. Libby never gave a straight answer. She would only say, "There are many kinds of truth. Some you prove, others you preserve." Then one afternoon, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small cassette tape wrapped in cloth. A note accompanied it. "You were right. Keep this one safe. Don't play it until it matters." The handwriting was Sam's. Libby turned the tape over in her hand. It wasn't one of the original reels. This was newer, copied, clean. She placed it in a drawer, locked it, and didn't look at it again for months. But knowing it existed changed everything. It meant Sam hadn't disappeared into greed or guilt. She had chosen a harder path, carrying the truth where no one could reach it. Years later, when Libby's book was adapted into a documentary, people began calling the house the Kennedy Witness Home. She hated the name but tolerated it. She kept the tours small, intimate. She wanted people to feel the silence, to understand that history wasn't just words and dates, but lives that bled into one another. She guided visitors herself, her voice steady, her hair now streaked with gray. Sometimes when she spoke of her sister, her throat tightened, but she never let it break her composure. One rainy Tuesday, a woman in her 50s visited alone, standing back from the tour group, her face partially hidden by a scarf despite the mild weather. There was something familiar in her stance, in the way she studied the photographs on the wall. When the others had gone, she remained examining the restored photo of Kennedy and Jackson. "You've done a good job with this place," the woman said without turning around. "Made it speak again." Libby felt her heart stop. The voice was lower, roughened by years, but unmistakable. "Sam?" The woman turned slowly, the years etched into her face, but her eyes were the same. "Hello, Lib." For a moment, neither moved. Then Libby crossed the room and embraced her sister, feeling the solidity of her, the reality that had been missing for so long. How? Libby began, but couldn't continue. I had help, Sam said simply. People who understood what was at stake. I've been in witness protection, more or less. Unofficial, but effective. The tapes? Safe, not destroyed, not sold, just waiting, like I said they would be. That evening, they sat by the fireplace, the years between them folding like a map. Sam told her story in pieces, how she'd been approached by a former CIA agent who had his own reasons for wanting the truth preserved, how they had created a secure vault in a private archive where the tapes would remain until the classified period ended. 50 years, she said. That was the agreement. In 2023, they go public. All of them. Why come back now? Libby asked. Sam looked around the room at what her sister had built from the ruins of their discovery. Because you succeeded where I would have failed. You kept the story alive without selling it out. And because, she hesitated, because I missed you, Lib. Some truths matter more than others. That night the sea was restless again, wind tearing across the dunes, rattling the shutters. But inside, the house felt different, complete in a way it hadn't been since that first night they'd spent there together. You know they're not going to like you being back, Libby said as they sat watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Let them come, Sam replied. The story's already out there. Can't put that genie back in the bottle. One evening, long after Sam's return, they sat alone in the living room, the light from the fireplace flickering across the walls. The sea outside was loud again, waves crashing against the rocks like memory against time. Libby reached into the drawer and took out the cassette tape Sam had sent years before, still sealed in its wrapper. The note was still there. Don't play it until it matters. She looked at her sister. Does it matter now? Sam nodded slowly. I think it does. Libby placed it into an old tape deck she had kept all these years. The machine clicked, hissed, and for a moment there was only static. Then came Jackson's voice, clear, steady, and defiant. My name is Harold Lewis Jackson. If you're hearing this, I'm already gone. What I saw in Dallas wasn't random. What I heard in that room wasn't speculation. There are men in this country who believe power belongs to them by right, not by law. They moved against a president who threatened that belief. I don't know if the truth will ever come out, but I had to try. The message ended with the sound of waves, the same sound filling the air outside their window all these years later. The sisters sat in silence for a long time, the fire burning low between them. When the tape finally clicked off, Sam reached over and took her sister's hand. We did right by him, she said softly. Yes, Libby agreed. We did. She rose, crossed to the window, and opened it. The cold air flooded in, sharp and clean. The ocean glimmered under the moonlight, endless and patient. The house settled around them, the floorboards shifting softly as if in agreement. It no longer felt haunted or hollow. It felt inhabited by memory, by truth, by the simple echo of voices that had finally learned to speak in harmony. When they turned back to the fire, the light caught the old photograph of Kennedy and Jackson now hanging again on the wall. They smiled. History had a way of hiding its real witnesses in plain sight, but sometimes if one listened carefully enough, the silence told the story anyway. Years passed quietly after the sisters' reunion. The sea still broke against the rocks beyond the lawn, but everything else had changed. The once forgotten mansion had become a place of quiet pilgrimage, though not for the reason most people imagined. They came not for Kennedy, nor for the myths of power and scandal, but for what lingered after. The story of two sisters who unearthed a secret and found something larger than any headline. The weight of truth and what it costs to carry. The Warner sisters had aged into women both softened and sharpened by experience. Their hair the color of salt, their hands lined with ink and years, but their eyes still carried that same flicker of searching light, as though perpetually looking for a sentence not yet written. They had made a life in the house that once nearly consumed them. Now it was their work, their devotion, their redemption. It drew the curious, the students, the weary seekers who wanted to believe that truth could still live somewhere, untouched by spin or profit. Each morning, they walked the halls before opening hours, the floors no longer groaning beneath their steps. They would pause by the old photograph, Kennedy on the lawn, the photographer behind the lens, and feel the same quiet wonder that had once upended their lives. It was early spring when the letter arrived. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar. Libby opened it by the window where the afternoon sun fell across her hands, Sam reading over her shoulder. Inside was a single page. Ms. Warner, I am the granddaughter of Dr. Eleanor Franklin. My grandmother passed last winter. Among her papers, I found a transcript of a conversation she recorded years ago. Your voices from opposite sides of a great divide. She wanted you to have it. She called it the final dialogue. I don't know what that means, but she said you would. Folded within was a compact disc labeled in faded pen. November 12, 2015. Hyannis Point. The sisters stared at it for a long time, the air around them suddenly still. They listened to the recording together, hands clasped as their past selves spoke across years and distance. Sam's voice from the recording, explaining her choice. I told her I'd keep it safe. And I did. But safety is just another form of hiding, isn't it? We spent our whole lives trying to be safe. From debt, from failure, from being forgotten. She wanted to tell the truth. I wanted to survive it. Maybe both were right. Dr. Franklin's voice. Do you regret what you did? A long pause. Then Sam's sigh. No. Regret's a luxury for people who never had to choose between truth and peace. But I hope she understood. The real Sam, sitting beside her sister, squeezed Libby's hand. Did you? Understand? Eventually, Libby answered softly. It just took time. That autumn, as tourists thinned and the coast grew quiet, a young journalist arrived, polite but persistent. He said he was working on a documentary about historical cover-ups. I read your book, he told them, eyes bright with reverence. Do you think the tapes will ever surface? The sisters exchanged a glance, a lifetime of shared secrets passing between them. Maybe when they're ready, Libby said with a smile. The young man frowned. You make it sound like they're alive. In a way they are, Sam replied. Every truth has its own timing. Force it too soon, and it dies. Wait long enough, and it begins to speak for itself. That night after locking up, they walked down to the beach together. The sand was cold beneath their shoes, the tide pulling softly at the shore. They stood there listening to the sea's endless breathing. When they returned inside, the house welcomed them with a familiar settling of timbers. They lit the small lamp in the study, its glow catching the frames on the wall. Among them was a final plaque they had added just months ago. It read, The Warner Sisters Archive, in memory of those who saw and remembered. They stood before it, feeling the strange symmetry of it all. The house had begun as a secret, become a wound, and ended as a voice. It had taught them that silence was not the absence of truth, but the space it grows in. Outside, the wind eased. The house seemed to exhale with them, settling into its foundations. Somewhere within the old pipes, the faint hum of air moved, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. As night deepened, they sat by the window, watching the ocean shimmer beneath the moon. The waves rose and fell with the same quiet persistence that had carried them through everything. Grief, guilt, discovery, forgiveness, and finally reunion. They felt no loneliness anymore, only continuity. When dawn arrived, Light spilled gently across the floors, illuminating the dust motes like gold. The house had become what it was always meant to be, not a keeper of secrets, but a teller of stories. And in its quiet, enduring voice, it would carry everything they had ever been. The truth, the cost, and the fragile grace of two women who had finally found peace. Not in forgetting, but in remembering together. Have you ever been separated from someone you love, only to find your way back to each other? Share your story in the comments below.